thanks very much for coming along, especially on such a lovely evening. Well, it's a lovely evening where I am here in Greenock. I'm just going to assume that it's quite nice where you are as well. I'm being optimistic about things, right? So we've got a lot to get through tonight. We've tried to pack a lot in, okay? Lots of different things for us to get through, and ultimately, what I'd like to get out of tonight, I think, is not just for me to talk at you about stories, but to hear your stories. That's really part of what this is all about. It's about finding out other people's stories and how we can work together. But I'll tell you a wee bit about what I mean as we go. Stories have been part of my life for a long time. So my first job in the sector was back in 1990. It was my first volunteering role, and I worked for a communications project, a local communications project, and they would like write press releases and design newsletters for community groups back when that was like cutting out things in Letraset and photocopying before Adobe and Canva, which are much better, obviously. But back then it was all very hand stitched, and it was the same message then as it is now about trying to help people convey what they wanted to say about their projects and what they want to do, and help them get their message across. Nowadays, I run a comic company, a community interest company, and I work with schools and community groups to tell stories using comics, everything from history to, this is a comic, for example, about some care experienced young people. So that all different types of ways of telling stories. Visually, I quite like using visuals, but in fact, we're going to look at lots of different ways of sharing stories during this project. And that's the thing. There's so many ways to access and enjoy stories these days, from podcasts and community radio to blogs, Instagram. There's some principles that I think are worth keeping in mind, regardless of what the medium is. And there are some practical things to think about in terms of how you capture and present those stories. And tonight we're going to try and cover both, a bit of both. So we've got a bit of theory, a bit of practice, and then a bit of a blether, right? So we're trying to cover as much of a range as possible tonight. So I'm going to chat a bit from my own experience about finding and sharing community stories. Then there's some time for questions about any of the issues that I've raised there, and then we'll break into groups, and we're going to take some time to tell or share a story. Don't panic about that. I'm going to make it really easy, right? We're going to share a story ourselves, and then we'll hear maybe one or two of those back in the main group altogether, and then we'll hear from Hyde Justad, who is former editor-in-chief of Radio Oracle, a community radio station in Oslo, and she's going to give us some practical tips for recording stories and capturing stories, that kind of thing. So you've got a bit of everything. That's what we've tried to go for, and all of this is by way of an introduction to SCCAN's mission to find and share 1,000 better stories. And what we hope is that after tonight, we'll maybe be able to work with some of you some more on sharing your stories, or that you'll consider getting more directly involved with our story weaving project and some of the other training sessions that we're going to be running. In the first instance, what I'm doing for the project as Story Weaver is collecting stories of climate action for podcasts preliminarily, right? But there's lots of other ways that we're going to do things as well as looking at story strategy in terms of how we shape stories to influence others. We're going to cover lots of that tonight, just very briefly mention it. But before we go any further, I thought, because it's all about stories, I'd tell a story. And actually, I'm going to share a traditional story here. Next month, Tuesdays for Climate session is delighted to have Sir Jeff Palmer along to talk. And I was lucky enough to meet him and work on a project that he was involved with last year. And this is a traditional story that was told as part of that project, and it's called Anansi and the Pot of Knowledge. Anansi is the Spider King, lord of all the stories. Sometimes he looks like a spider, sometimes like a man, but always he's a trickster, trying to get one over on folks. Now, Anansi was already clever, but he figured if he gathered all the wisdom of the world, he could keep it hidden away. Then he would be the smartest creature in the world. So he gathered it in from all the wise folk in the secret places, all the wisdom in the world, and he sealed it in a pot. Anansi knew just where to hide it, at the top of a tall, thorny tree in the forest. His son, Kuma, saw him sneaking into the trees and decided to follow. The pot was too big for Nancy to carry while he climbed the tree, and he kept slipping back down. And he got angrier every time that he slipped. Tie the pot behind you, and you'll be able to climb properly, said Kuma. And Nancy was so annoyed that Kuma was right that he let the pot slip, and it smashed, and all the wisdom fell out. And just then, a storm came, and it washed the wisdom into the river. And from the river, it washed out to the sea, and then all around the world, and to all of us. And Nancy and Kuma walked home in the rain. And Nancy was maybe just a little bit wiser than me. Because after all, what's the use of all that wisdom if a child has to put you right? So there's the pot and all these beautiful illustrations for that, incidentally, were done by an artist called Barry Robertson. Nancy's stories, they're the best, they're amazing, right? But I haven't just randomly chosen that. There's some relevant symbolism there in terms of the suggestions of young people being ignored, or people greedily trying to control their resources, in this case, wisdom itself. But I also think that's relevant to this evening. Now, there's something in there in the idea of us all kind of holding on to our stories, forgetting to share them, and actually they're so much more valuable when they're shared with somebody else. That's the beauty of folktale. They speak to us on a fundamental level. They work so well because we can project our feelings and our understanding onto them. That's what makes them timeless. That's why I would just use an ancient folktale for some modern chat. Stories which succeed, stories that are remembered, stories that are retold, have that universality, have something we can connect to or experience, or a feeling that we recognise. And they're all around us. It's really just down to us to frame them the right way and tell them in the right places. Because that's exactly what SCCAN wants to do here. We want to help people imagine a better future a different way. And right now, what I had thought, and this team have chatted about, is thinking that our principal starting point is that having lived through, living through a crisis which has created some level of shared experience. I mean, it's not a great leveler, right? It's not done that, but it has created something that we all have in common. We should start where we are right now. So let's talk about what worked in terms of our response to the crisis, and then move on to talk about how recovery from this segues into green and just recovery. What if we kept the things that worked? But here's a different story. A study last week by King's College in Ipsos Mori looked at how people feel about potential COVID vaccination. And there was lots of interesting information in the reports. But one of the main points that came up that was reported on was that people who get their news and information via WhatsApp are much less likely to accept a vaccine. Now, the story in the press was focusing on unreliable narratives, on conspiracy theories and misinformation, and how that has changed how people make decisions. But for us, I would suggest that the takeaway might be about how the information is consumed, how the stories are told at a micro level. The focus was negative, it was critical, it was about people who consume this information in this way are potential health hazards, right? And putting the rights and wrongs of that to one side, lots of people consume information in that way now. And if all of us want to convince people to make changes, then maybe we need to go where the stories are being told, where they're making a measurable impact on how people choose to live their lives. And that isn't always going to be in the national press or at shiny launches or at events or even online. It's sometimes just going to be outside our front doors, or it's going to be in a local WhatsApp group, or it's going to be in a really, on a micro level on information that you share with people in your street. We all have to become storytellers, is the point. Sharing what we do, sharing what we believe, and that can be a bit tough because not everybody's like me and likes the sound of their own voice. But actually, the voice is the most important bit. Not how it sounds at all, not at all how it sounds, but whose it is. Because what we want are a range of diverse voices, a wealth of experience, an abundance of ideas. We don't just want people who volunteer in projects telling us about what they're funded to do. We want the people who volunteer and access projects and services to talk to us. We want community organisers to talk to us. We want people who are challenging current systems thinking. We want them talking to us, but more than anything else, we want emotional connection, because that's where you get people on board. And what we're hoping is that you, all of you who have kindly joined us tonight, can help us find, tell and record these stories from across Scotland. Because although I'm the story weaver, and that's definitely the best job title I have ever had, I am also just one guy sitting in a room under the stairs in Greenock. So, you know, I'm only going to get so far without lots of people helping out, right? The first hurdle to go over is one that I think that I've repeatedly bumped up against across Scotland, because I've done lots of story work in lots of different ways. And I have to say, this is a particular issue in central and west Scotland, or post-industrial towns, and that's believing that you've got a story that people want to hear, because you're so used to nobody listening. So as a sort of a live example, here's my hometown of Greenock, which just before the COVID crisis was at the end of January revealed to be the most deprived area in Scotland, according to the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. 6 weeks later, it was swiftly established that we were also the COVID capital of Scotland, with infections and fatalities up to 3 times higher than the rest of the country. And yet, that managed not to be the overarching story. Instead, our story became one of mutual aid, of the resurgence of community spirit, and in particular, how climate action focus groups in the area came to the forefront of the community response, from redistributing surplus food to providing recycled bikes to key workers and refurbished laptops to homeschoolers identified as most in need. This was the story that the town, our town, my town, chose to tell about itself, rather than the story that was being told. And sure enough, the fact that we were a COVID hotspot and a responsive community near enough to Glasgow, where BBC and STV were, meant that loads of news crews suddenly started to turn up. And Inverclyde, I think, has been featured on the news just about every week since then. These things, though, these same responses, they'll have happened, I'm sure, in your communities, right? And as they have all over the country, but circumstance made them newsworthy here in Inverclyde. And the sharing of that story has created an impact locally, a sort of virtuous circle. I suppose the point I'm making is that on this occasion, we told a different story and people listened. The act of listening is hugely important in finding and sharing stories, especially when you're trying to establish an emotional connection. It builds trust, helps create a safe space for people to talk. So when you're chatting to people, maybe try to find us some stories, or you're recording your volunteers or fellow activists or colleagues, something to bear in mind is the notion of deep listening. It's got its roots in mindfulness techniques, often used in counselling or treatments, but I found it works really well in community settings when looking for stories, because it's about giving people your genuine, undivided attention and taking the time to think about what they're saying and respond to it, not just rattling through a tick list of questions that you want to get answered about a project, actually engaging them in conversation and the back and forth, finding out more, digging a little bit deeper. It's about how you listen. In particular, the thing that I like most about it is this idea of listening between the lines for the things that have been left out, and asking open questions to make it a really, a conversation rather than a grilling, I think, is the thing, right? How did that make you feel? That's always a really tricky question for people to answer, and sometimes they'll dodge around doing it, but you'll get there in the end. On the way there, you'll be surprised what people will tell you, the things that you might find out, the other information you'll hear, the other stories that will come up, the reasons why they do what they do. These moments of emotional connection that you generate in that conversation are the same pieces of emotional connection that are going to work when you retell your stories, right? You'll be aware, I'm sure, of the principle of 3-act structure of stories. You hear about it a lot in films. It's most easily exemplified, you'll have heard it in school even, way back when, beginning, middle and end. A story has to have a beginning, a middle and an end, right? We're all familiar with that kind of structure. Maybe you'll also have heard of the notion of stories being into the woods, where crossing into an unknown or unfamiliar place creates challenges which the main character has to overcome. They change as a result. But all stories are about change. From the big superhero blockbusters to family histories or feel-good stories in the local press, they're all about change. There's all sorts of diagrams and structures that seek to explain the notion of story that's apparently hardwired into us. And although we're now starting to seriously examine the cultural and gendered norms that are also hardwired into those structures, the principle of there being a moment of change in stories is well recognised. Again, even in community stories. You know, there was a need for this activity in my community because, or we came together to take action because. There's a moment where you went from not doing the thing to doing the thing. And the chances are why that's one of the most interesting parts of your story. But it's not just how you structure a story that's important, it's how you tell it. Just because something's factually true doesn't make it meaningful. The reality is, if a story is meaningful to people on some level, they're more likely to believe it's true anyway. I mean, I'm not advocating this approach, but the notion that before the facts you establish an emotional connection is often the best way to convince people, as evidenced by not just this piece of campaigning, but lots of campaigning about establishing a vision, a future, appeal to people emotionally with a vision that you think is going to be better. There's pages and pages of that kind of stuff online, but I particularly enjoy and would recommend this wee book here, which is Do Story by Bristow. And there's lots of key principles that she discusses about how you do story. And it's used in lots of different types of storybook. But here's the basic principles, which I'm just going to very quickly go over to. I mean, normally you could spend a whole day just going through this whole process, but as an overview, as an introduction. So this idea that you tell your stories if you're telling it to a friend. Conversational. That's how listeners or readers or whoever will experience it if you've got a conversational tone. They'll experience it like you're a friend, like you're talking to them like you're a friend. That tone can really help create a sense of connection and bond. Don't get bogged down in the detail either. Explain where you are, what the project is and everything else, but keep it short. We don't need years of context. We just need the here and now. Keep it short and simple. Don't have loads and loads of words in there to make it sort of sound a bit more interesting and important. In fact, people prefer their information short and sharp. Juxtapose. Don't mash stuff up. The crashing together of ideas, the flipping of expectations, that's what make an interesting story. So, for example, Inverclyde being a deprived area that was particularly unpopular and frequently, in the news in a bad way, alongside the story of a community that helped one another. Those ideas didn't quite go together. They created a juxtaposition that created a good story. The Gleaming Detail. Now, I've used this example a couple of times when I've spoken to the team. The SCCAN podcasts that were on created last year, which you should absolutely go and listen to. There's a conversation that happens in a repair cafe, and this woman talks about a jumper that she bought at a charity shop, and she really liked the jumper. It would normally have been a really expensive jumper, but she got it at a charity shop. She wore it loads, and then it got a hole in it. And she went along to the repair cafe, and at the repair cafe, they showed her how to mend it. And there was lots of interesting stuff in that podcast about the project and what they were doing, but that is what stayed with me about the project, about the place, the gleaming detail, the fact that this place had changed a woman's relationship with clothes, with repair, and made her feel that she could keep using something. That was good. It was simple and it was good. Be vulnerable. Like, I love stories where people learn from mistakes, or where they're nervous, or they explain how worried they were about something, because that makes them feel more like me. We all feel a bit like that, and being honest and open about that in your stories, and even in the process of talking about how you created a project or what you're doing and how it didn't all work out, that's great too. People love to hear that stuff. Tune into your senses. Well, again, in the story of the jumper, there was a tactile sense of the wool and feeling it, but there are other senses as well. A lot of the stories that people have told from their time in, during lockdown is the bird song, is hearing the bird song. That is a very, very sort of emotive way of explaining the senses. The trickier thing is, bring yourself to your story, be in it. Now, this is something that Again, lots of people do struggle with it because they, you know, it's not about them or they don't want to be in it. But it's your voice. If you've got something to say about a story, we've all of us got a responsibility to do it. You know, it's like I'm saying earlier, we all kind of need to be storytellers, even if sometimes that's about telling stories about ourselves a wee bit as well. And eventually, let it go. Don't keep running on forever. Just make the point, build to a conclusion, then end it. Less is more. You know, we don't want hours and hours. We just want 10, 15 minutes. Right? Is that all making sense so far? Sort of, kind of. Okay. Mostly, we've been looking at collecting and sharing stories of things that already exist. With a view to, you know, perhaps those are some of the things that you can do when you're looking for stories within your communities. And the reason that we need to do that is not just to celebrate the good work that's going on or pat ourselves on the back or any of that sort of stuff, but to help show what's possible. If this can be done now, why can't we keep doing it? If they can do that over there, why can't we do it over here? What if we did it this way? Creating that inspiration, that dissonance, that's vital to creating an influence and change. We talk about a crisis of the imagination quite a lot, but we have to be careful not to sound like we're condemning people for having a lack of imagination. That keeps people at a distance. It can put folk off, it excludes folk. Rob Hopkins and lots of others talk about instead the redistribution of imagination, to get back to a place where imagination is not a luxury. And I like that. I like that idea that we therefore should absolutely be telling stories about our future, which in fact is already the kind of thing I've been hearing from folk that I've been lucky enough to meet so far on the network, new community food networks that they're setting up, or rewilding groups, or any of the other amazing stuff that's going on. And every single principle I just shared about how you tell a story about something that's happening applies equally to telling a story about the future. From the gleaming detail of the change that you want to see in your community and how that impacts on one individual, through to the sensory experience that that change is going to create. And Ansi, that we heard about earlier, is part of the creation myth of Ghana. Creation myths, well, they're the stories that we tell ourselves about how we came to be. They're important culturally, but we also have our own versions in family trees or in organisations and groups of friends, how we got together, how we started to be. They help us define who we are. But conversely, you might also have heard of control mythologies, which are the parts of life that are presented as kind of self-evident truths, things you can't argue with, things that are just too big to change. There's nothing we can do about it. Things like there will be a technological solution to the environmental crisis, or that all economic growth is good. These are just huge truths, inalienable. They're the control myths that we have to change, that we have to rally against. And already, over these last 2 months, we've seen a new control mythology of the new normal being asserted, pushing us all swiftly back towards the arguably unsustainable status quo that existed before the crisis. It's framed in all sorts of ways, positive and negative, from moral duty to saving the economy. And it's hard to counter the comfort of what normality used to mean. It's understandable. After a period of such extreme change, people maybe want to feel how they felt before, but there are chinks in that armour. More people do want to work from home. More people have recognised the importance of a green recovery. More people have a greater appreciation of the environment around them if they're lucky enough to have somewhere nearby they can go. That new normal hasn't yet been written. It's not been completely established. And in the meantime, we can tell the stories that help define what that normal might be. Because it's going to be a battleground for at least the next year, if not more. And in that time, now, that's when we can use stories to do something different. Now, obviously, this is just a really quick discussion to kind of get us started. There's things that we're not looking at tonight, like, for example, how lots of, when you're telling stories, it's actually the editing where the storytelling process happens. There's also stuff around the accessibility of stories and making sure that people can appreciate them from all different types of situations. And also, we have still got some really practical recording tips and everything to come from Hyde. But hopefully, in that very quick overview, you've got an idea of where we're coming from. So thank you very much for everything so far. Thank you for letting me come in and hear some stories. Now, lots of big talk tonight, right? Lots of big talk. But I suppose the untold story is what do we want? at SCCAN, and how can you get involved? So really straightforwardly, if you have a climate action story about something that your group, your organisation, or anybody that you know are involved with, and you'd like to chat with me about it, then you get in touch. I'll tell you about in a wee moment. If you'd like to help us source and pull together stories from across Scotland, helping research or blog or record stories, get in touch. If you'd like to be more generally involved, maybe attend some further training, which hopefully some of that we'll be able to do face-to-face, fingers crossed, over the next 6 months, then get in touch. Maybe I could come along to your group, meet your organisation, and you could show me around and tell me what you do, right? And if you already know what your story is, right, maybe you got a wee flash of inspiration there in the group, or you just knew anyway before you came, and you'd be happy to record it for us, get in touch, right? So the best way to get me at the moment is stories@communities. Hang on, I'm going to flash it up. I'll put it up at the end. I'll put it up at the end. That's easier. Right?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, and or you can get me on Twitter as well, right? But assuming that some of you are up for this notion of doing some stories and stuff, and in fact you'd maybe even be interested in recording some stories from across your community and sharing them with us for the podcast and stuff, right? Then what you really need, I would guess, is some practical advice and information as well, right? So I've done the theory, right, and I've done a wee bit of blethering, but Heidi's got really practical information that she's going to share with you now, some of her expertise. So I'll hand over to Heidi.
Great, thanks. That's lovely, and I have to say, I really enjoyed those stories in the breakout group. That was such a great little interlude. So I do a 2-day workshop on, so I work in radio and in podcasts, and I do a 2-day workshop. So this is just a really, really, really sort of top tips little guide as to how to record a story. So if you've already done it, if you have a podcast or something, or if you have radio experience, then you probably know these things, but just to kind of make sure that everyone has that information. So I'm not going to talk about how to structure it or really the content. So that's what Paul's been talking about, and that's your own kind of how you want the story to be. I would say you might want to think about the so there's how you record it, there's the environment you're recording it in, and then there's any editing or what do you do with the file once you've got it, the sound file. So a lot of people think that you have to have so a fancy microphone or a kind of recorder like this, which is handy. It is good. This is handy for, you know, radio level recordings or whatever, but you can record using your phone or perhaps using your computer. But what I would say is whatever you're using to record, and it could be that maybe you can also borrow something like this or a microphone that you can plug in, for example, with a USB from an organization, or maybe your organization already has some. But the way that you can tell if the sound is good enough is you just record something using whatever you're going to use. Maybe it's your phone or anything. And then you just take that file and put it into a computer or something, or maybe just put a headphone jack, listen to it on headphones in your phone and just hear what it sounds like. And really get the volume up. So, you know, be careful about your ears, you know, don't make it too loud, but just so that you can hear what the sound quality is like, because you'll be able to hear if it's good enough by doing that. And on that note, I would like to make also about volume. So when you're recording, you will record at a certain volume. And with sound, volumes are measured in decibels. And basically you don't need to know anything about decibels or recording or anything, but what you need to know is that between -12 and -24 is really, I'm just going to put it in the chat, and -24, that is an okay volume. That is decibels. So you don't really need to know much more than that. It's just that if it's louder than that, you'll lose quality, and if it's quieter than that, it'll be too quiet, and people won't be able to hear it on all their normal listening devices. So once you've found a device or some kind of setup where you think it sounds okay, what you want to do is make sure that your recording environment is a good one. So I don't know if you can hear right now, but actually there's music coming in from my window. You might or might not be able to hear that. But if I was recording something here now, I would shut the window. But there might be less obvious sources of sound. So for example, my fridge, I'm in the same room as my fridge, and sometimes fridges make a kind of hum that we just ignore in daily life, but it'll come across it might come across in the recording, or sometimes certain kinds of sounds, lights will make a sound. So those kinds of things, if you have a little look around, and also in that little test recording you did, those kinds of things may come across. If you hear a mysterious hum, try and go into a different room or something and see if that hum is still there. So the top tip really for absolutely excellent top quality recording is a duvet. So might sound a bit weird, but basically what you want to do is have your duvet over you. Bit hot just now, I know, but like you know, just wear a t-shirt or something, and then have your duvet over you and the wall in front of you, and then have your recording device, so say if it's your phone, and have it just under your mouth. So wherever the microphone is on the phone, or on the microphone, have it under your mouth, so that you're not, when we talk, we make all kinds of sounds with our mouth, like pertha and stuff, and that sounds kind of bad on the microphone. So if you have it under your chin, those sounds won't come into the recording, whereas if you have it like this, you'll really hear the sound of your breath. So that's a handy tip. In fact, these days I actually think mask wearing probably is a bit of an improvement for the sound. If you were to have a microphone in front of you, the mask would probably catch a bunch of those sounds. But I wouldn't recommend it, because it might, you know, make your voice quieter or something. So, but that's a sort of side effect of the situation. So, and you want to be sure that you don't have drafts. So that's also what the duvet really helps against. You don't have drafts. Any kind of wind or moving air will be picked up by the microphone, and you'll be able to hear it in the recording, and it just won't be a good sound experience. So that's all very technical, but the thing about recording and sound is that when you're making a recording of sound, whether it's a story or anything else, you're coming very, very close to somebody. So the listener is, you might be in their headphones, they might be out on a jog, they might be doing their washing up, that you're in their everyday life. Just think about yourself, how you listen to radio or podcasts or music or anything. You're really very close to them. So you can use quite an intimate tone. You can talk as if to one person, even though maybe many people may hear it, but it kind of just one person at a time, right? So you can be very close in the kind of tone that you use, and that can make the words that you're speaking come across in a kind of a close fashion. It's very rainy here in Edinburgh just now, so apologies if that's coming across the sound. Yeah, so, and that's a really fantastic benefit of sound, just that kind of yeah, and of course, if so once you've got your once you've recorded whatever you want to record, so your story, you've got it recorded. If you want, you can do it, you know, several times, tell it over, you know, and then pick which one you want to use. then the file itself will be what's called a WAV file. So that's .wav. And when you take it, so you might send it to a computer, or I don't know, like however you're going to get the file out of the whatever you've recorded it in, then you're going to WAV files are great, that's what you record in, but that's not what people listen in. What they listen to is an MP3, so .mp3. Sorry, this is super technical, but it's actually just some very small little steps that will lead from that recording to the kind of finished recording. And I'm just typing in the chat here. So Audacity is a free, open source, very light, so it doesn't take up much space, editing program that you can use, or perhaps if you're using your phone, maybe there's an app, or maybe if you don't have access to anything like that, you could also probably just send the WAV file to Paul. So that's all, or perhaps you have someone in your organization who works with this, who knows more. But if you want to just do it yourself, it's pretty straightforward. So Audacity, you download it, it doesn't take up much space. And then what you'll do is you'll put your file into the program, Audacity, and editing sound is a lot like editing text. So you've got cut, copy, paste. You've got all these functions. You've got the undo button, just like in Word. So it's pretty similar, really, to editing text, except you use the little microscopes, the zooming in and out. You use those a lot more. So what you can do there is, you've got your story, so you won't need to do much, but you might want to just cut out maybe the beginning, if there's a little space before you started, and maybe the end if there was a little rustle while you turn off the recording, for example. And then if you might have said like or or stuff like that, which is totally normal, just absolutely how we normally speak, you can zoom in and just pick those out and just select them with the mouse and press the backspace button to just remove those those little sounds if there are any, or perhaps maybe, I don't know, there was a dog barking in the background or something and you can remove that. There is also a function that you can use to remove background noise if there was any, but I would say you really want to hopefully have removed that noise in the recording situation, have made sure that that noise isn't there. So that's really what you want. And any irregular background noise, like a door slamming or something, that would just have to be, if there's talking at the same time, that whole thing will either have to come out or it'll still be in there with a slam in the background. So if you can let people know around you, hopefully not to make too many loud noises just when you're recording. And one thing that can really help at that point is if you use headphones while you're recording, and it might sound a bit strange because it's your own voice, there you are, you're just talking, and you know, of course you can hear your own voice, but if you're I don't know, it might be actually that this story is a story someone else is telling and you're recording them telling the story. Even with your own voice, using the headphones is great because it will let you know if there's anything wrong with the recording. So for example, maybe the battery is dead on the device, or there's not enough storage space or something like that, because it's the worst feeling to get to the end of it and realize it hasn't worked for a kind of basic reason like that. And it's happened to all of us, you know, it's just that little technical thing of, it doesn't have to be, I've got these like big massive headphones, it doesn't have to be big headphones, just be little earbuds, just so that you can hear the sound, so you can tell if the sound isn't there. That's a kind of one of those basic principles. Yeah, and then just like in any story that you're telling to someone who you don't know, anything with names or places or acronyms, just be aware that they might not know what you're talking about, and so to give that, I think Paul also mentioned this, giving that kind of context. Yeah, this is really compressed, but does anyone have any questions? Does it make sense what I've said so far? Okay, I can't actually see everyone on the screen at the same time, but the people who have seen seem to be okay. Okay, and it could be that actually many of you are really very on top of this, the kind of technical aspect. But I will put sort of shake your head there. Yeah, well, it's really just a small threshold to getting into it, but it's just kind of handy if you have that information. So I'm going to put my contact details in the chat as well. I'll just put an email in there because oh, that's good to hear, Fiona, because I'm just about to go abroad. But so if what you want to do is try it out and see how you get along, and then if you hit any snags, then you can just contact me and be like, oh, it's not a WAV, you know, like what's happening, or how do I get rid of this persistent hum in the background, for example, as it is possible to do that with Audacity. Actually, maybe I might just say a brief word about that because it's just the one function that might be useful for you. So, so when you're in Audacity, if you're in the English, so basically there's something called noise reduction under effects in Audacity. I'm just going to write it in the chat here. And what you want to do is select a bit of silence. So when you're making a recording, you always want there to be a bit of silence. You can let it be at the beginning or somewhere underway, because you can have your shoulders really low while you're talking, and there can be some pauses to let things sink in for the listener. And often we think that we have to kind of entertain the whole time and be kind of with lots of content, but when people are listening to something, if you think about how you listen to the radio and you think about how you do have time actually to process, because often you're doing something else at the same time, like driving or whatever, then you can leave some gaps, or maybe at the end. And then when you've got your file into Audacity, you'll see it'll be a stereo track. So that means the right side and the left side. So there'll be two layers of sound, but they'll be basically the same thing, and anything you do will affect both layers. And what you'll do is you'll just select, you'll use your mouse to just pick up on that bit of silence. And the noise reduction you'll click on the noise reduction button to get the noise profile. So it says get noise profile, and that means that Audacity will learn what is it, the sound that you want to remove. You want there to be silence there. Actually, there's a hum, and it might be from your recording device or something, or or maybe a road or something that's hard to kind of, you can't really move away from the road that's outside your house or whatever. And then once you've got that noise profile, what you'll do is you'll select your entire file, so the whole of the recording, and then you'll click on the kind of OK button and the noise reduction tool, and it will remove that sound from the entire bit of the recording. So what you need to do then is just listen back a bit to the sound, and if it sounds like your voice is underwater, you're going to have to undo that. So probably it won't, probably it'll be fine, but you just need to listen back just to check that it's worked, and then you'll be done. And then what you do is you'll export your file as an MP3. So you'll go to export as an MP3, and then it'll be ready, and you can send it off and it'll be posted as a podcast or whatever. So that's really it, and you don't need to do that step if you don't have that sound in the background. Yeah, I mean, anything else that anyone would like to know about that sort of recording aspect? Well, in that case, that's actually that's us done there. So back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. Right, so just to be clear, we've told you how to sort of put a story together, and the kind of things that you might want to tell us, the sorts of areas you might want to cover. And Hyde's told you exactly how to record it. So if you could just send all the MP3s to me by the end of next week, then we'll get those into a podcast seconds flat, no time at all. Genuinely, that is what we want you to do. We'll give you a wee bit longer than the end of next week, right? But what we're hoping is to generate this sort of culture of storytelling within the network, right? That you feel that you can just quickly record as something and pass it on. Yes, David.
So Hilary is asking in the chat, can you say more about what the SCCAN podcasts are looking for? How many minutes? Is it just 1 minute things, or is it 3 minutes? And then what questions might be useful as prompts?
Okay, so a few folk have asked as well if we're going to share the notes and the video for tonight, which happy for us to do. And you'll see there's some question prompts in the slides, but additionally I can add some further ones to that are what it's really just about it being open-ended. I think you almost want to set out from the notion of it not really being like an interview, more of it being a conversation. And if you were sitting down to get to know somebody, you would just, it would evolve naturally. You might record it all in exactly the way that Hyde's saying, but you might then only go back and take like 2 or 3 minutes of absolute gold out of that hour-long conversation that you've had. And that's okay, right? In terms of what we're looking for the podcast, so I think we're looking maybe at about half an hour an episode, and we're quite keen to have a few different things featured in each one. So we're happy to look at anything from like a minute or two up to maybe about 10 minutes. If you've got a longer conversation, 10, 15 minutes, that's about the top end of it. But, you can send us the raw audio and I can help edit that together to get to the thrust of your story with a wee bit of back and forth between us to collaborate on it. And also we're interested in not just stories about what we're doing, but like I quite like the idea of there maybe being practical things like recipes shared, shared thoughts on food or traditional stories that maybe relate to what you're doing, so that we're going to structure it a wee bit more like it is like people sitting around a table blethering and sharing food and talking. That's kind of the feel that we're going for. Sadly, unfortunately, right at the moment we can't all get around a real table, so we're trying to kind of create that as a podcast. Does that make enough sense to folks? Basically, send me anything. We'll use it. We'll find a way of using it. We're genuinely, you've got stuff to say and we want to hear it. And there will be more opportunities for us to come together and talk in a wee bit more detail, maybe about things, about both the sorts of things that I was talking about and that Hyde was talking about. Tonight was an overview, was an introduction. And you could go away from tonight and quickly put something together. But there'll be chances for us to do a wee bit more as well. One of the things, and you'll see David's highlighted it there in the chat, is that we're going to put together a story circle within SCCAN where hopefully, people will be able to shape how we're doing this. It's not set in stone. I've set out what the start of this process is for us tonight, but it's going to continue for months, and we're happy and we want people to influence that and be involved in the direction of where we're taking it. It's like I was saying earlier, that I'm making an assumption that if you've come along tonight and you're part of this kind of network, that you're involved in some way or another with some type of climate action. That might be that you volunteer, you might run a group, you might be a staff member in a group. I don't know, right? But what I'm interested in is just two things. It would be not just you telling us what you're doing. Remember, I don't just want project stuff about this is what a project does. I want information about how it makes you feel, why you do it, right? So that could be about you recording yourself telling us about your project, or it could be you recording a conversation with, for example, someone who works at your project, someone who accesses the service. If you're like a community garden, someone who comes to plant. If you're a community food initiative, maybe people who work in the kitchen that you've got. Anybody at all that you think we want to hear their voice as well. We don't just want to hear from the professionals, we want to hear from the volunteers, the activists, everybody. Is that right? Okay, so from my part, I suppose, as we're nearly just about done, thank you very much for coming along and sticking with us and sharing stories, right, which, you know, is a big first step. And I saw a few folk there saying a heads up on what the stories might have been. Fair enough, right? Okay, I think next time we'll give you a wee bit more warning and you can come prepared. But sometimes I quite like, if you think too much about it, you know, sometimes the first story you tell is actually the best one anyway. But thank you for your patience on that. That's much appreciated. Big thank you as well to Hyde for that really practical, useful info there. That was fab. Thank you very much, Hyde. To Joanna, obviously, for helping us out. Fab. Philip and David as well for lots of help organising. So fantastic stuff from everybody tonight. Thank you very much for coming along, and hopefully just the first of what will be a few wee story gatherings like this over the next few weeks. So watch out for it. And hopefully you can get involved with telling some stories next time around.